Hello everyone, Eric Aldrich here, and in this video I want to talk about the definition of science fiction. Whether you are a student, a reader, or a writer, it helps to have a good definition of science fiction if you want to explore the genre. So what I'd like to do to start off is share Isaac Asimov's definition. Isaac Asimov, of course, is one of the best science fiction writers of all time. And Asimov said, science fiction can be defined as that branch of literature which deals with the reaction of human beings to changes in science and technology. I want to focus on the part that says deals with the reactions of human beings to changes in science and technology, because I think that is really key to understanding science fiction and what it is. I'm going to add another definition so I can sort of back up what Asimov said. This is Theodore Sturgeon's definition that came 25 years before Asimov's. A science fiction story is a story built around human beings with human problems and human solutions, which would not have happened at all without its scientific content. Which would not have happened at all without its scientific content. So what we're hearing these great writers say is that in order for something to truly be considered science fiction, the science has to have a central role in the plot, in the conflict, in what the characters deal with, and how they overcome the challenges in the story. So let's take a step back from that sort of really honed-in definition and look at the umbrella genre of which science fiction is a part. And what I'm talking about here is speculative fiction. The two main genres we encounter under the umbrella of speculative fiction are, of course, science fiction, and the other is fantasy. Arthur C. Clarke made this observation. Science fiction is something that could happen, but you usually wouldn't want it to. Fantasy is something that couldn't happen, though you often only wish that it could. So, if we're thinking about the difference between science fiction and fantasy, it's very easy to find works that are representative of the polar ends of that spectrum. So, on the hard science fiction end, the story that I'm going to use as an example is Clarke's Rendezvous with Rama. And on the fantasy end, the obvious example to use, I suppose, would be J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings includes magic, it includes wizards, it includes dragons. The things that J.R.R. Tolkien combined to make that epic adventure are elements of pre-Christian European religions. Tolkien himself was a scholar of Beowulf and of Old English. That's why he designed that beautiful elven language. That was the fodder, that was the material that Tolkien pulled together to make Lord of the Rings. Rendezvous with Rama is a story by Clarke in which an alien spacecraft is traversing our solar system. It appears to be dormant. Earth sends some scientists out to check it out. They get in and they can explore this spacecraft. This story is asking the question, what would a spacecraft have to support biological life on intergalactic journeys? This is clearly a scientific question. So again, on the poles, the far opposites, it's easy to tell the difference between science fiction and fantasy. I teach science fiction, and I often find that people sort of look in the gray area, the area between those obvious differences. And one thing that people identify in the gray area are superhero stories, Marvel, DC, comic books. And so maybe we'll talk about those for a second here as an example of something that certainly fits in the speculative fiction genre in its own way, but is not something that I would call science fiction. This is not a criticism of these stories, and I recognize that there are significant scientific elements in those stories. So, for example, Superman is an alien. In Spider-Man, Peter Parker is bitten by a spider and gains spider-like abilities. In X-Men, the characters undergo some sort of a genetic mutation that gives them their superpowers. In all of these stories, there is a scientific touch. There's a little nod to, well, wait a minute, why does Superman have superpowers? Well, he came from another planet, they have superpowers there. Oh, okay, cool. Why is Spider-Man able to shoot webs and, swing throughout the city? Oh, well, he was bitten by a radioactive spider. Oh, okay, cool. In both those instances, the plot of the story, the question that the story looks at, is something to do with good versus evil. People using superpowers for good, people using superpowers for evil. Their superpowers are extensions of their wills, they're extensions of the power that they want to enact in society, and it is an extension of how we think that power should be used ethically in society. These are great questions, but we might call them something more like an epic. There's maybe more similarity between Superman and Beowulf than there is between, Superman and Rendezvous with Rama. So even though those stories have some nod to science, it's not central. It's not what Asimov would say. It's not dealing with the reaction of human beings to changes in science and technology. It's exploring the age-old struggle between good and evil. So if we're thinking about this, we're establishing a spectrum, right? Here we have fantasy. In the middle, we have something like our superhero stories that have a little nod to science, but still function primarily like fantasy. Moving along our spectrum, we encounter what I would call soft science fiction. Science fiction writers and readers and scholars draw this distinction between hard and soft science fiction. Soft science fiction is science fiction that has science as a primary part of the plot and conflict, but understanding the science is not as central to the story as it is in hard science fiction. I mentioned Rendezvous with Rama. This is a hard science fiction story. My example for a soft science fiction story I'm going to go with is a big one because I used big ones for the other two examples. I'm going to go with Star Wars. Star Wars is a soft science fiction franchise. Is science central to the story? Well, yes. This plot of Star Wars takes place in a galaxy far, far away, long, long ago. We're understanding that time is relative throughout space and that a culture could have evolved prior to us that was more advanced than we are. Are Jedi superpowers just magic like Gandalf uses? Well, no. Jedi have midi-chlorians within their cells, which are sentient beings and who work with the body of the Jedi to produce the Force. So in some ways, Star Wars does include science. There's the spaceships, there's the social aspect of it where the different alien races are coming together and interacting. Those are elements that we might say are like science fiction. On the other hand, it's still primarily a struggle between good and evil. It's Luke versus Darth Vader. It's the Empire versus the Rebellion. And we see some of the same plot devices that we see in our superhero movies. Another sort of comparative example that I'll use between hard and soft science fiction, using Star Wars again, and I'm going to compare it to Star Trek. In Star Wars, the Jedi fight with lightsabers. Well, what is a lightsaber? A lightsaber is a sword. They look really cool. They're a really creative and fun concept. I'm not dissing lightsabers. I love lightsabers. But is a lightsaber really a realistic weapon for a futuristic space empire to fight with? Not really. It's a cool looking sword. If we look at Star Trek, what are the weapons that they use in Star Trek? Well, they have phasers. Remembering that Star Trek came out in the 60s when Gene Roddenberry created it, at that point in time, we didn't have stun guns, we didn't have tasers, we didn't have non-lethal weapons that police could use or that other people could use in self-defense. But a phaser in Star Trek can be turned to stun. You can either put it on kill, you can put it on stun. And when you think about what a phaser is on stun, well, it functions very much like a stun gun or a taser. It's something that stops someone, it paralyzes them, but it doesn't kill them. So Star Trek was asking the question, how can someone create a weapon for defense that is more ethical, that doesn't kill or harm the person it's used against as much as a real weapon, a gun, would? So the phaser in Star Trek is solving a scientific problem. It's asking a scientific question, and of course now we have non-lethal weapons for those purposes. We're not really designing, lightsabers. The cops aren't going to start carrying those anytime soon because they're fantasy, they're fun, they're really cool, but their science is not the foundation of a lightsaber. So moving back to hard science fiction, in hard science fiction, understanding the science or the implications of the science is central to the plot. Rendezvous with Rama, I'm not criticizing it, I love this story, but the character development isn't really what you would get in literary fiction. The characters are there to explore the spaceship so that Arthur C. Clarke and his readers can think about, wait, if we wanted to leave Earth and we wanted to travel for long distances between galaxies in space, what would we need to do that? Well, we'd need an enclosed environment, we'd need different ecosystems, we'd need some sort of a hibernation cycle. The things that we would need and the size and the scope and the scale of the spaceship or the spacecraft we would have to develop, these are questions that are directly addressed in Rendezvous with Rama. Now, is it fantasy? Has a spaceship flown through our solar system? Not that we know of. We don't know that that's happened. And so Clarke did have to invent this thing. He thought it up himself with his imagination. But he created scientific parameters for his imagination and scientific parameters for the story. And because of those parameters, he wrote a hard science fiction novel. So I hope this is helpful. I'll just reiterate quickly. Science fiction is part of speculative fiction. The main two genres under speculative fiction are science fiction and fantasy. There is a spectrum within those genres where they relate to each other and they differ from one another. Both science fiction and fantasy have many subgenres. You know, there's aliens, there's time travel, there's cyberpunk, there's alternate history. There's many subgenres of science fiction, there are many subgenres of fantasy, but in this video I'm just talking about the broader strokes. And so I hope this is helpful. Do you agree with my definition of science fiction? Have I explained the spectrum within speculative fiction accurately? Are my examples solid examples? Let me know. And I hope that this video was helpful to you in your study of or pursuits in writing science fiction.